And here is part 2 of the game design versus player experience. A Twitter discussion of all things. Well, Twitter is 140 characters per tweet, so it's difficult to have a discussion of any depth. So I tweeted, if a person thinks a game is good with fancy graphics, but that the same game isn't without the graphics, there's something wrong with the person, not with the game. Because I was limited to 140 characters, that was a little more forceful than I intended. Well, some people agreed and some disagreed. Eric Lang, for example, who is a very well-known designer these days, said, "The sentiment is nice, but reality is way more nuanced than that. Many great games depend on their production quality." And Mike Mearls, D&D, 5th edition, agreed. Also, Lang said, "Let me be clearer, discounting social dynamics, the experience of play incorporates design and aesthetics." And I'll interject at this point, my definition of great game is probably far more restrictive than his. Brett Myers, who is another designer, chimed in with, "That suggests a converse corollary, that fancy graphics can make a bad game good." And yes, it does suggest that corollary, but it's one that I completely disagree with, which tends to support my point, I believe, rather than the notion that graphics are necessary, really nice graphics are necessary. In any case, I said, insofar as graphics influence the user interface of a game, then the graphics are part of the game design, assuming you can get the publisher to go along with that. Matt Morgan said, "This is quickly going to devolve into what is a game, as a value of presentation varies with type of game." To which I responded, could devolve into a discussion of what part of the experience the designer can control. And that was the end of the discussion, and reminded me that I should finish this screencast. Keep in mind, fundamentally, in tabletop games, the designer does not control the graphics, the publisher does. In video games, it varies. So, what are the responsibilities of designers? And what's the player's responsibility? Well, there's a difference in a one-player game, or a two-player game, or a game for more than two players. Game designers can't control the experience of play, which depends on the people, the situation, and the timing of play. But if there's only one player, they have a lot more control than if there's more than two players, because there aren't other players around to mess it up, in effect. Now imagine you could fully control the experience of a game so that no one ever had a really bad experience and no one would have a really good experience either. The game would be pablum, bland or insipid intellectual fare, or trite, naive, or simplistic ideas. Something we already see a lot in video games and more in tabletop, and which can describe many party games, pablum. Or to put it another way, pacing sort of demands that in order to have good experiences, you may need to have bad ones as well, or at least ones that are bland. What are the responsibilities of the players? For example, is it the designer's task to save bored losers from themselves? You know the type of person, they're losing and they're bored and they're unhappy and they mess with things and they twiddle their thumbs and so on and so forth, and they're distracting. After all, some games involve winning and losing. This again is more a tabletop thing than a video game thing. To me, a bored loser is a task for the player group to deal with. Players need to monitor one another. Ultimately, players shouldn't play with the kind of person who becomes a bored loser if they can't change how they behave. It is not the designer's job to somehow save that person from himself, from his boredom, or from his own irresponsibility. You have to have some responsibility when you play a game. It's not like a movie. Movies are passive. Novels are passive, for the most part. Yes, art movies are not entirely passive. But the consumer is not having any input into the movie or the play or the novel. They're doing things in their head, but they're not inputting into the original work. In a game, which is active, the player is inputting into the original work and changing it. And so there's a greater responsibility on the player. And of course, players differ so much. As a simple example, some people fight to the end as a matter of course when they play a game. They feel it's their responsibility. Some other people, they're not succeeding, they want to quit. Some of those people should not play serious games because they don't have the attitude for it. And by serious, I mean games that people take seriously as opposed to party games or family games. Not serious in the video game usage of educational, more or less. In particular, people who are brought up to think they're the center of the universe, which is the extreme of the me generation, are unlikely to be suitable serious players of games for more than two sides. Now, if there's just two sides, then the player can resign and that ends the game. So, some people need to stick to party games or games like party games, which are inherently irresponsible, where winning and losing isn't a major point and doesn't really matter. Are designers responsible for fun? I've looked at tabletop publisher submission guidelines and often see some form of this statement: game must be fun to play. That's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous statement, because how enjoyable a game is depends so much on the preferences of the target market. There's no such thing as a fun game, period. And often when you approach publishers with that notion, then they'll start to talk about what they actually like, and you find out that their idea of fun is this, where the next publisher's idea of fun is that. To me, fun in games comes from the people you play with and the circumstances. That's how people can have fun playing a dire game like Monopoly or even a super serious game like chess, because of the people involved in the circumstances. Lots of people enjoy playing chess, but half of them wouldn't call it fun. So, what are designers responsible for? They're responsible for making their game interesting and enjoyable for their target market. They're not responsible for players having fun. That's up to the players. And I'll leave you with this thought once again. Players must be responsible for their entertainment in games. They have to bring something positive and active to the game because games are active. They're not passive.